The pyramids at Giza have survived earthquakes, empires, and roughly 4,500 years of desert wind without moving an inch. Egypt's rulers, the men those monuments were built for, couldn't say the same about themselves. Some of the most powerful figures in the ancient world were finished off by a hippo, a sword slipping out of its own sheath, or armor so heavy it dragged them straight to the bottom of a river. History remembers the gold masks. It usually skips the part where the story is embarrassing, means united Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE, founding the first dynasty and setting the template every pharaoh after him would spend the next 3,000 years copying. He held the throne for an estimated 62 years. For a Bronze Age ruler, that's closer to a miracle than a reign. He had outlasted rival kings, put down rebellions, and built the administrative backbone that would run Egypt for millennia. He didn't die defending any of it. According to Manetho, the Egyptian priest and historian writing centuries later, Menes was killed by a hippopotamus. That detail sounds almost too absurd to include in a serious account of ancient history until you look at what hippos actually did along the Nile. They weren't the slow, harmless creatures modern zoos present. They killed more people annually than crocodiles did, capsizing fishing boats, crushing anyone unlucky enough to wander into their territory, and defending stretches of riverbank with a level of aggression most predators don't bother with. A king who had spent decades subduing human rivals met his end doing something as mundane as standing too close to the water. A handful of later accounts swap the hippo for a swarm of wasps, which, if anything, is a less dignified way to go. Either way, the man credited with inventing the Egyptian throne couldn't outmaneuver an animal that spends most of its life sitting motionless in mudskip forward nearly 3,000 years to 47 BCE. Egypt was now ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty. Greek by blood, Egyptian by crown, and the teenage king Ptolemy XIII was locked in a civil war against his own sister, Cleopatra VII, for full control of the throne. Julius Caesar had thrown Rome's weight behind Cleopatra, and at the Battle of the Nile, Ptolemy's army broke apart. The young king tried to flee across the river by boat, still dressed for the role he'd been playing throughout the entire war. Gold-plated ceremonial armor, built to project untouchable royal authority, not to survive a capsized boat in open water. When the vessel went down under the weight of fleeing soldiers, that armor did exactly what heavy metal does in water. It pulled him straight to the riverbed. His body surfaced later and was identified by the breastplate still fused to the corpse, the same object meant to broadcast his power to anyone who looked at him, now serving as the reason he never reached the opposite shore. Cleopatra, watching her brother's civil war collapse into a Roman-backed victory for her side, inherited the throne largely uncontested. The boy who wanted to look like a god drowned because he refused to take the costume off. Persia conquered Egypt in 525 BCE under King Cambyses II, and Herodotus records him as a ruler with little patience for local customs, particularly the worship of the Apis bull, an animal Egyptians believed carried the living spirit of the god Ptah. To the Persians, it was livestock with a fan club. To the Egyptians, it was one of the most sacred beings in their entire religious system. When priests celebrated the arrival of a newly identified Apis bull, Cambyses reportedly interpreted the celebration as mockery aimed at his failed military campaign in Ethiopia, which had cost him men and supplies with nothing to show for it. He stormed the ceremony and stabbed the bull in the thigh with his own sword. The animal died of the wound days later, and Egyptian priests recorded the insult for generations. What happened next depends on how much trust you place in Herodotus, but the story has survived for over 2,000 years for a reason. Mounting his horse in a hurry sometime afterward, Cambyses' own sword slipped free of its sheath and struck him in the thigh, in the exact same spot where he had wounded the bull. There was no reliable way to treat a deep puncture wound in 522 BCE. The injury turned gangrenous and it killed him within weeks. Herodotus framed the whole thing as divine punishment for insulting a sacred animal. You don't have to believe in curses to notice that the coincidence writes its own headline. Tutankhamun took the throne around 1332 BCE at roughly 9 years old and was dead before he turned 19. For most of the 20th century, that early death fed every theory imaginable. Poison slipped into wine, a violent blow to the back of the skull, a jealous rival clearing his own path to power. CT scans and DNA testing conducted in the 2000s complicated all of that considerably. Tutankhamun had a club foot linked to Kolar disease, a condition that restricts blood flow to the bones of the foot, and his tomb was packed with over 130 walking canes, several of them showing clear signs of actual use rather than ceremonial display. His bloodstream also carried multiple strains of malaria at the time of death. A serious infection on its own even for a healthy adult. The scans found something else buried in the data, a fractured left thigh bone with an open wound sustained not long before he died. For a healthy adult, an injury like that is painful but survivable. For a teenager already weakened by malaria and a genetic bone disorder that made walking difficult in the first place, it was enough to trigger a fatal infection that modern medicine would have treated in an afternoon. Several researchers point to a chariot accident as the likely cause. Chariot riding being a documented pastime of his, despite having a body that was in no condition for it, and despite the fact that Egyptian kings were expected to be seen hunting and riding regardless of what their doctors would have advised. He is buried under more gold than most of history's kings ever touched in their lifetimes, and the leading scientific theory for his death is still, essentially, a bad fall from a vehicle he probably shouldn't have been allowed near. When Howard Carter broke into Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the press did what the press always does with a good story. Lord Carnarvon, the aristocrat who financed the entire excavation, died just months later, and newspapers around the world ran wild with talk of a pharaoh's curse reaching out from beyond the grave to punish the men who disturbed it. Nobody has ever found a curse inscribed anywhere near that burial chamber. What sealed Egyptian tombs did contain, and in some cases still contain today, is something far less exciting but considerably more plausible. Fungal spores and bacterial colonies capable of surviving thousands of years in an airless, sealed environment. Aspergillus in particular can trigger severe respiratory infections in anyone with a compromised immune system, and tomb air had never been tested for that kind of contamination before archaeologists started popping them open in the 20th century. Carnarvon wasn't a healthy man going into that tomb. A shaving cut on his cheek reopened an old mosquito bite, the wound became infected, and whatever pathogens he inhaled inside that sealed chamber likely made an already bad infection considerably worse. He wasn't cursed by an angry god protecting his king. He was killed by a nick from a razor blade and several thousand-year-old spores, and the truth simply turned out to be far less marketable than a curse. Not every dumb death in ancient Egypt belonged to a king. The laborers who built the pyramids at Giza around 2560 BCE were paid, fed, and buried with a measure of dignity. According to the worker cemeteries excavated near the site in the 1990s, this wasn't the slave labor that pop culture has spent a century imagining. But the work still killed people, and it rarely happened in ways worth a legend. Skeletal remains recovered from those cemeteries show crushed vertebrae and shattered limbs consistent with dragging limestone blocks weighing over 2 tons up wooden ramps that had essentially no safety margin built into the design. A rope frayed under sustained tension. A block shifted 6 inches in the wrong direction on an incline. A worker's foot landed wrong on a slope slick with sweat and sand. Any one of those was enough to end a life, and none of them made it into any inscription anywhere on the finished monument. These men spent years of their lives building something meant to make one man's name last forever. Most of their own names were never written down at all, and the ones that were survive only on tiny work crew graffiti scratched into hidden blocks, never meant to be read by anyone. Ramesses III ruled Egypt around 1155 BCE and was murdered in an elaborate palace conspiracy engineered by one of his secondary wives, a woman named Tai, who wanted her own son placed on the throne instead of the officially designated heir. CT scans conducted in 2012 confirmed his throat had been cut deep enough to reach the vertebrae, settling a debate that had run for decades over whether he'd actually been assassinated at all. The plot that killed him reads less like a calculated royal assassination and more like a badly organized cult meeting that somehow succeeded anyway. Surviving trial papyri describe conspirators using wax figurines and smuggled spellbooks in an attempt to magically incapacitate the palace guards so the assassins could get close enough to strike the king. Dozens of people were implicated in the plot by the time the trials concluded. Palace officials, women from the royal harem, and even several of the judges who had been appointed to try the case, who were later caught accepting bribes from the accused and attending parties with them during the trial itself. Those judges lost their noses and ears as punishment once the corruption came to light. A king was murdered with the help of fortune tellers and stolen curses, and the men sent to deliver justice on his behalf were too busy drinking with the killers to notice what was happening under their own roof. Around 1558 BCE, King Sekenenre ruled southern Egypt during a period when the north was controlled by the Hyksos, a foreign dynasty Egyptian sources treated as an occupying force. Sekenenre is remembered as the king who started the war of liberation that his sons would eventually finish, and his mummy, discovered in the 19th century, still shows exactly how that war caught up with him. His skull bears at least 5 distinct wounds from different weapons: an axe, a dagger, a spear, inflicted from multiple angles that suggest he was already down and unable to defend himself by the time the later blows landed. His hands show no defensive wounds at all, which forensic examiners have taken to mean they may have been bound at the time of the attack. This wasn't a clean death on a battlefield. It looks like an execution carried out on a man who could no longer fight back. Possibly after being captured, Egypt turned that brutal ending into propaganda for the next generation, using his death as the justification for the war that eventually expelled the Hyksos entirely. His mummy became a symbol of the price to be paid for building a kingdom back from occupation, though the man himself likely experienced it as nothing more dignified than being ambushed and finished off while already helpless. Ancient Egypt gets remembered for gold death masks, engineering precise enough to align with the stars, and monuments that still draw millions of visitors every year. What rarely makes it into the documentaries is how ordinary most of these deaths actually were underneath all that gold. A hippo, a slipped sword, armor too heavy to swim in, a chariot ride a broken body couldn't survive, a razor cut that let ancient spores finish the job a curse never had to. These men believed the throne made them untouchable. The Nile never got the memo.